In our reading today from Luke 15, 1 through 3, and 11 through 32, in the New Revised Standard Version, it is in the Bible in your pew if you want to look at that. Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to the father, 'Father, give me my share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was far off, his father saw him, and he was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him, kissing him. Then his son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get a fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead, is now alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard the music and dancing, and he called to one of his slaves, 'What is going on?' He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has got back home safe and sound.' Then he became angry and he refused to go in. His father came out to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you. I have never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who had devoured your property with prostitutes, and you killed a fattened calf for him.' Then the father said to the son, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost, and he has been found.'" And here we have our servant from Jesse.
Not long ago, I had a discussion with my kids about what Bible lessons that they remember from church camp. Kind of putting them on the spot a little bit, but they give a good lesson. They said, "Oh, that's easy. It's the Good Samaritan, the fruits of the Spirit, and the prodigal son." They're not wrong, because those 3 scriptures have been the framework for dozens of curriculums that I've used over the past 30 years, so I get that. So when I saw that the lectionary text for the week was the prodigal son, I thought, oh my gosh, people are probably just sick of hearing this parable, and they don't want to hear another sermon on it. But the lectionary gave me Luke, and we've been kind of being consistent about going through Luke, so I guess I'm going to have to do it. So I went into my computer and thought, I wonder how many sermons I've preached over the last 14 years on it. You know how many I found? 2. And I thought, no way, this is a story that everybody's heard over and over and over again. So I looked in my backup drives, because my backup drives, my home computer and my laptops and things like that, it was just copies of the 2. And so I thought, well, have I really only preached 2 sermons in the last 14 years on the prodigal son? And the answer is, I guess so, but I tell you, I've used it a lot in camp, so that's probably why it's so fresh on my mind. I think people are pretty much familiar with the basics of this story. It's a common theme, a meta theme. Remember, folks, from Faith and Film, it's a meta theme that has been found forever in literature and in movies and in song. The story starts out. There was a man who had 2 sons. One of the sons demanded his share of the inheritance, but he blows it on wine, women, and song, and he becomes homeless. So he comes back and begs his father to take him back, and the father says, of course, and welcomes him back. Let's throw a party, too, while we're at it. But the older brother says, what the heck, Dad? Are you seriously going to welcome this son of yours back home and throw a party? I've always been faithful to you, and what have you ever done for me? And then the dad says, yeah, thank you for your faithfulness, older son, but this brother of yours was once dead and now he's alive. He was lost and now he's found. And so then the preacher gives a sermon and asks the big question, who do you relate to most in this story? The younger brother who was unfaithful but thankful for the grace that he received, or the older brother who was faithful but resented the grace his younger brother received? And see, that is low-hanging fruit for a preacher, right? I mean, this is the sermon that you pull out of the files when you have had a crazy busy week and you don't have time to do the research, right? But there is so much to this story that is here beyond what's on the surface. It's kind of like last week's parable, the parable of the vineyard. We don't always understand the full meaning of the story because we are so far removed from the time and the culture. We don't comprehend the nuances that folks in the first century would have noticed in this parable. So, the first thing that we've got to look at is why Jesus even told this parable. And that's why I had the first 3 verses read instead of just the story of the prodigal son here. Jesus told this parable because some Pharisees and scribes were criticizing him because he welcomes sinners and he eats with them. And before he got around to telling this parable about the father and the 2 sons, he told a couple of shorter parables too. He told one about a lost sheep that had been found, and he told a story about a woman who lost a coin and found it. So he saved the big one for last. And so these parables were told in order to explain why Jesus welcomes sinners and eats with them. Here's another thing to consider. This story would have sounded absurd and outrageous to the listeners of the time. Because by demanding his share of the inheritance, the son is rejecting his father and his family in a way that basically says, I wish you were dead. And also, what he asked for was not money. That's where our modern minds kind of get tripped up on this thing, because we think of, the kid wants his inheritance, so he wants dad to cash out the trust fund. That's not the way it worked, because when we talk about his inheritance is property, which means livestock and land that has been in the family for generations and generations. And in order to sell this land for cash, the son would have had to find somebody outside the family, an outsider, to sell this, to cash it out. And that would have been a huge disruption to the family's business and the way that they operated and the way they were able to live and make a living. And then there's the scandal of the father's response. Now, culturally speaking, the father's correct response would have been not only to reject his son's request, but to punish him for even making such a ludicrous demand. Even if the father gave into his son's demand, the son still would have been expected to retain control of that land so that he could pass it down to his children and grandchildren and so on and so forth. Again, by giving his son the land and the right to sell it so that he could cash it in and go do whatever it was that he wanted with it, that was scandalous. That was absurd. The people hearing that parable would not have believed it. The scribes and the Pharisees and maybe even the other people in the audience would be like, oh, come on, Jesus. Could you tell us a story that is at least realistic? I mean, this is crazy. This wouldn't happen in a million years. Here's the third thing to consider. We call this story the prodigal son. What is prodigal? What in the world does prodigal mean? Prodigal means somebody who is wasteful. So when we talk about the parable of the prodigal son, we think of the son's wastefulness, right? He wasted away his life with the money that he made by selling his inheritance. What this parable should have been called, though, was the parable of the prodigal father. Did you feel the shift in the air from the collective gasp? What do you mean, the prodigal father? What in the world are you talking about? That's an outrageous suggestion. And that's not what the parable's called. I mean, look here in my Bible. It says right over the paragraph, the prodigal son. I've made prodigal into two words, the prodigal son. But you know, those headings in the chapter, they weren't there. They were not there in the original manuscripts. In fact, you didn't see those little headings until only a few hundred years ago when the Bible was translated into the common language and was made available to the public. Because when we're flipping through our Bibles and things, we like to see where the stories are. So those are pretty recently. See, the heading that I think is most accurate, and I've seen in Bibles, is the lost son. Not the prodigal son, but the lost son. But if prodigal means wasteful, and you want to use that word in the title, I think the prodigal father is the best. Why? Because the father's grace was wasteful. Think about that. The son was given the freedom to reject his family, to wish his father dead, and to squander what his father and generations before him spent his life working for. Prodigal son, like he's the hero of the story. Because where in the story does it say that he expressed any kind of regret for what he did? Because the only thing that I see in this kid is a fear of dying and for a wish to have a roof over his head to be fulfilled. The son thinks it's all about him. He doesn't even consider what he did to others. And you might say, well, yeah, but it says here, I have sinned against heaven and against you. But guess what? That is exactly what Pharaoh said to Moses in order to get Moses to make the plagues stop. Pharaoh wasn't repentant. He just wanted his suffering to stop. And that seems to be the case here with the younger son. He wasn't happy living with the pigs. So he wanted to come home. He even rehearsed this "I'm sorry, Dad" speech ahead of time because he figured that's what would get him a place to live. He'd get him out of the pig troughs, right? Here's something else that would have shocked those who heard this parable. Jesus said the father ran to greet his son. Even before he heard his son's selfish, pre-rehearsed excuse, the dad ran to him when he saw him coming down at the end of the road. Running to greet his son would mean that he left his dignity, his honor, and his right to enact punishment on his son, which, by the way, would be the expected response of a father whose son wrecked a family so badly. running would also have been considered disgraceful. Get this. It would be considered shameful because running would have exposed his legs, which back in that day was a big no-no. It was considered disgraceful and undignified for that day, especially for a person of his social status. And then he said, "Oh, here's my son. Go find a robe for him, the best robe, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet." That ring was not just a random piece of jewelry for fashion's sake. It was likely the family signet ring, which would grant the wearer access to the family's resources. The modern equivalent, I suppose, would be getting him a Brooks Brothers suit, giving him the passcode to all the bank accounts, and a master key to every building and barn on site. And then there's the exchange between the father and the oldest son. Once again, the father ignored social norms and left the party. That would have been considered so rude because he would have left his guests hanging. Very rude. He was the host, Speaking of the, it would have been rude to leave the guests, especially to go appease his oldest son's anger. And if you want to talk about the oldest son's anger, let's not forget how he must have been feeling. He didn't think he was being treated fairly. And to be honest, most of us wouldn't blame him for feeling the way that he did. He's the good kid. Dad never threw a party for him. However, according to social norms of the day, this son's behavior would have been considered unacceptable because he is supposed to be subordinate to his father. This is one of those, "you talking back to me?" type of a moment, right? Dad is the boss. It would be disrespectful for him to challenge his father's actions. He separated himself from his family to tell his father how he's entitled to his family's resources. What we take for granted as a relatable story was shockingly scandalous to the people who heard it. Oh, and, let's not forget why Jesus told this story in the first place. He was responding to criticism that he welcomed sinners and ate with them. So for Jesus, the answer to their critique is, I'm only doing what God would do. And guess what? God isn't fair. There's that shift in the air again. What did you say? God is not fair. That's what Jesus was saying. Jesus dropped the F word right in the midst of those people. Dr. Song Nai Rhee, one of our professors in college, used to say that the biggest F word in Scripture is fair. That's what that is, right? We humans want things to be fair, to be balanced, but we only want to use our definition of what fair is. What we think is fair isn't always what God thinks is fair. See, the scribes and the Pharisees that were there that day, they're behaving like the older brother in the parable. They felt like they'd done everything right and are more deserving than those tax collectors and sinners. It's not fair that Jesus eats with them. Here's the point of this scandalous parable, though. The lost son and even the faithful son are just a setup to the highlight to celebrate the Father's kindness. There was a man who had 2 sons. The banquet wasn't about the lost son. It was about the Father's grace. The scribes and Pharisees who were criticizing Jesus for eating with sinners are like the oldest son. The tax collectors and sinners are the younger son. What those scribes and Pharisees fail to see is that the banquet is for everyone. It's not just for the tax collectors and the sinners. Those scribes and Pharisees, they were invited to that banquet too, but they chose not to eat with those sinners and tax collectors. It's on them. The table has been set. The invitation has been sent to everyone, but they can't get past the F word. It's not fair. Now I can ask this question. In this parable, who do you relate to the most, and more importantly, why? Are you like the youngest son who may not really understand what you've done is wrong, but you're still under the mercy and grace of your father? Are you like the oldest son who feels slighted and resentful because you don't think your father is being fair, even though he's the only one who has the right to actually show grace? Or are you like the father who doesn't care what anybody else thinks? You're going to be radically kind and merciful and gracious to all, even if it doesn't meet everyone's expectations of what fair is. May God's mercy and grace and love abound here on earth as it is in heaven, and may God bless your time of reflection on this parable. Amen.